Hi, everybody. I'm Corey Minton, Director of the Observability Strategist team here at Splunk, and we are live from Splunk's .conf22 on the final day here in Las Vegas. It is quite stunning that I have maintained my voice for this entire 4 days in this dryness, but I am really excited to have a chat with one of my old buddies, Tom West, Senior PS Consultant for Splunk. Tom, how you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic. It's been an awesome conf.
Awesome conference. Some big highlights. Obviously, conversations with Lando and Zach yesterday were awesome as it relates to motorsports and McLaren. But another big highlight for me was actually getting to meet you in person. For those that you don't know, Tom West and I have a little bit of a history in the Big Data Beard podcast and blog team that I started a handful of years ago. And Tom West and I actually worked together on the road trip to .conf, where we took an RV for 2 weeks from Boston all the way to Las Vegas and then put it here on the floor in Vegas for conf19, the last time we had an in-person conf. And Tom actually built pretty much all of the dashboards and the beautiful visualizations that monitored our progress across the country. What else did we build in that, the cool dashboards you liked out of that one?
Monitoring progress through the country, the schedule for broadcasting,
Yep.
More or less how often you didn't wash your hands when you went to the bathroom.
We did try to wash our hands every time, but we were monitoring that too, because you can turn data into doing with Splunk for just about anything. And candidly, today's chat, I wanted to catch up with Tom because Tom had a chance to deliver a bunch of talks this week. How many presentations have you given this week?
I was lucky enough to do 3.
Do 3. And you notice that hat he's wearing. That is, why don't you tell them a little bit about the Splunk Trust for those that are wondering why you have such a fantastic cap?
It's fantastic. So it's I'm proud to be a member of the Splunk Trust. That is Splunk's global community MVP program that really acknowledges leaders within the community that have gone and contributed, whether it is via leading user groups, helping others on Slack, on the Answers sites, developing apps, or really anything just going out of the way to really help others with how they use Splunk.
That's right. Now, Tom and I actually worked on a project the following year whenever we had our first virtual .conf, where we did the race to .conf in the weeks leading up to conf, getting folks excited, getting them to see, Splunk applied to esports and sim racing.
Mm-hmm.
And wildly enough, that actually turned into your day job at some point, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. Yeah.
So Tom actually got one of his talks yesterday was really working side by side in a consulting capacity with McLaren's Shadow esports team. And we've talked a lot about this week, the simulators that we have on site. We're collecting data. We've talked about the F1 partnership with McLaren or with Zach and Lando. But this is kind of a cool, actually when we stopped talking about it and we started doing it, you actually showed up and helped solve some problems. So talk me through just as a high level, how did that engagement get started and what was the idea of what you were trying to solve for?
So we had a few different problems that we needed to solve when it comes to esports. We analyzed all the data that we could get, all the problems, and we identified 3 that we really could use Splunk to try and start helping them level up.
Okay.
One of them is around driver training, so making sure that they are performing the best that they can as far as training is concerned, making sure that the track performance is as good as it can be. Another one is driver selection. And for F1 esports, one thing that may not necessarily be known is that whilst in F1 in real, you'd have two drivers. In esports, that's not necessarily the case.
Okay.
A team can have multiple drivers, but when it comes to the series, when it comes to the actual race that's going on the day, you can only choose 2 of them. So the challenge there is which of the 2 that you choose, which are the 2 drivers that you feel would be best for that particular race. So we wanted to get all the data for the drivers, put that together and see if we could visualize and help the team remove any chance of any egos getting in the way and just use data to make those decisions. The final one is actually on the day itself of the race, helping the team with strategy, so making key decisions whilst the race is going on, just to make sure that they are on top of their game when it comes to the actual races.
Yeah, now I know some of the things that you've built are, I think would be considered competitive advantage. You're helping them use data to create a differentiated capability around those 3 areas, driver selection, training, and race strategy. Without divulging anything too, proprietary, talk me through in driver selection, right? If you have multiple drivers, you got to pick 2 for that final race day. What are some of the things that they look at that are interesting in terms of data or correlations that make sense for them?
So it's going to be things around consistency. So lap time consistency, and we can compare drivers to each other as well. So we're not just identifying individual drivers, but who's best on consistency throughout the whole lap. Who's best at managing the car as well. It's no good if you can put in fast lap times if you're going to need to go into the pits more often. An F1 esports race is only going to be around a third the length of an actual real Grand Prix. So any time that you need to pit, that's that's a lot more expensive than normal. So you need to be very good at managing the car. So using tires, and as well how close to the edge the drivers can be. Braking is the best practice with braking is the best way to get the most amount of speed throughout the car. So again, we're able to monitor driver input and consistency to really identify who's the best in that situation.
Yeah, and then same thing sort of like in driver training. I know one of the things that we built with the race2.conf some years ago was we built lap time comparison capabilities where you could look at the the time chart over time, speed over a lap. Is that kind of like speed tracing? Is that a similar thing that they're going to use for driver training, looking at like, braking points, gas, throttle brake inputs?
Yeah. So exactly that. The other one as well that's quite an interesting metric to look at, and maybe not one that is immediately thought of, is gears. Because if you can be very, very fine-tuned with your throttle and your brake input, and that can be quite difficult to try and translate from one lap to another when it comes to analyzing the data and go, right, okay, this is where I need to make performance improvements. However, those inputs also will usually translate into which gear has been selected and also help the rest of the team work with each other to actually go, well, yeah, we've got one driver who's faster in this sector to this sector. This is their gearing pattern. Should we go and try and map that? And that's something that's a little bit more easy to translate from one to another.
Gotcha. And we talked yesterday with Zach Brown. He talked about how data plays a significant role in the day of race strategy. And you talked about that. That's a real thing with esports. I'm curious because you think about race strategy, I think most folks probably know that, tires, they're the big consumable, right? Fuel isn't as much of an issue most of the time. But what does race strategy look like for McLaren's Shadow Esports? Because we can all watch an F1 race and we can see the pit wall and we can see everybody looking at the different screens. But like for an esports team manager, what does that mean?
So there's three different things that are going to define strategy. One is around damage, especially with the wings. If you have any damage whatsoever, even if it's 1%, your race is pretty much over. You just cannot get that extreme level of performance that the drivers are able to get out of the car. The other one is around weather, so understanding what the weather conditions are. And whilst you can kind of see that on the screen, the game does go and identify up to 7 different levels of severity. And so having that actually written down, having that come through via the data, allows them to understand how close that may be towards any wet conditions, anything that's really going to significantly transform the conditions of the track.
Yeah.
And what we've been able to do is been able to track the historical weather as the race goes on to try and understand, okay, how changeable are the conditions? If it has just started raining, understand exactly when it has. Can we get another lap in before we start changing the tires? How long has it been dry for? So how much longer can we get away with on the wetter tires before we make that decision to go to dry tires?
Yeah.
In the season last year, we had a lot of interesting results with wet conditions, so weather is a key one. And the final one is just understanding what the rest of the field are doing. So how they are performing as far as best lap times, what tires they're on, how much of an impact the tires are having overall to the rest of the field's performance, and finally any penalties that have been occurred. Towards the end of the race, if you've got a driver that's chasing another one, if that driver in front has a penalty, can then be a key decision to work out, actually, do we need to overtake this driver, or can we just go and coast behind?
Yeah. So one of the things that I found interesting when we started working with, the Formula One game specifically, I think is probably the best highlight. But iRacing platforms, clearly the same. There's data that's available and visualizations that are available in-game for the racer and for the spectator, and some of that is configurable in the heads-up display in the race. But there's quite a bit of data that's actually not exposed, that's actually being created by the simulator, that's not actually exposed anywhere in the UI. And that, I think, to me, that feels like a unique story that you actually can bring new insights to the game. And this is a gaming platform. Like if you played on an Xbox, you can bring insights by taking the data out that it's given, not just staying in the game. Is that part of the strategy there?
Absolutely, and the game does an amazing job of trying to give as much information to the driver, display as much data to the driver as it can do. However, those very fine metrics that are what is needed at that pro performance level, they don't always translate through. Like we mentioned, damage will come through via the game when it gets to a point, but it certainly isn't 1 or 2%, and that's what the kind of thing that we did identify when we were testing.
Yeah, that's awesome, and that's that's true in real life. I mean, it's always about having context. Yes, understanding one thing that's happening, but if you can enrich it with more context, decisions get better with more data. Now, when you think about in your working with McLaren Shadow and just your ideas as a Splunk Trust brilliant mind of using data, like what do you think the ideal future is for Splunk and McLaren Shadow?
There are really two things that I think would be really great as far as the future is concerned. One is whether we can continue to apply the data to improve training and performance, and maybe long term down the line we're able to get someone that's gone through the esports path and transition into real world cars, get into the Formula One circuit, and possibly even become a world champion. That would be fantastic.
Yeah.
If we can help with data, that would be brilliant.
Yeah.
Another area that we actually found quite a bit of interest with when we did the virtual racer.conf was around health. So getting drivers' health data in there, the amount of impact that adrenaline has, whilst certainly while racing, on the drivers has a huge difference. So getting more of that health data in, being able to make sure that the drivers are conditioned and that they're being looked after, because at the end of the day, we all have a responsibility to make sure that we look after and we enforce good well-being practices.
Yeah.
So using the data again to help there is a good thing.
So that story, though, that doesn't just apply to racing, right? What you just said is literally looking at, I have an outcome that I'm trying to drive. I think that there's some data that might be useful, and I certainly know that there's one data source. There may be many that could be impactful and enriching. Does the work that you're doing with racing, does it translate to the work that you're doing in other consulting engagements?
Absolutely. It's very, very similar. In essence, from a consultant perspective, from someone that's actually working with the data, we've got two separate things we need to understand. One is what does the data look like, and also what do we want to get from the data? But in essence, the data coming in, it can be shaped, it can be formed in very similar ways, regardless of industry. I've been lucky enough to work in other industries, such as automotive and healthcare, and really solve some difficult, complex problems using exactly the same techniques that we've gone and solved for McLaren with esports. And I really do look forward to continue to do it, whether it's with McLaren or whether it's in other industries as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really the story of what we've tried to accomplish in the activation, the Splunk and McLaren partnership here, was that concept that it's not just racing for racing's sake. It's not just because we love having Splunk on that beautiful McLaren F1 car on Sundays on the racetrack. We actually see it as one of the most interesting and engaging data sets that can be used in a way that's easy for people to kind of identify with, right? The story about racing and going faster is something that anybody that's a racing fan can really understand, and they get it. But using those same capabilities, whether it's Splunk technical capabilities, it's thinking about data architecture and strategy, it's about connecting business outcomes that you want to achieve with a technical deliverable. That's what Splunk is trying to do. And I love that data into doing story, and I love that you've helped make that real for Splunk so that we can show that, or for McLaren, that we're not just talking, we're not just playing video games, we're actually helping folks build skills with Splunk to go solve real world problems. We just happen to do it with racing data, which makes it a lot more fun. Well, Tom, thanks so much, buddy. I know you've been super busy. We're super proud of you for the Splunk Trust again, man. It's so good. And it's awesome to actually get a chance to be in person with you.
I
know our families have literally talked like, you got to see Westy.
Yeah.
But thank you so much. And as we always say with these motorsports related things here at Splunk, whatever you're into, be data driven and join Data Drivers.